Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Today, we have our 16th meeting of the Spatial Productivity Lab at the OECD Center for Local Development. We are talking about institutions and regional productivity. And as always, we would like to summarize for you main or most interesting findings in the academic literature, and then try to reflect on the policy implications of these findings. My name is Alexandra Tsvetkova. I lead Spatial Productivity Lab, and I will be moderating today's meeting. So we have a really outstanding lineup of speakers. I'm very happy about the discussion, and I'm looking forward to it. But before we go there, I would like to invite and introduce Alessandra Proto and Enrique Garcilaso. For those of you who join us regularly, you know Alessandra really well. She is the head of the OECD Trento Centre for Local Development, big champion of SPL. Happy to have her today again. And she is joined by Enrique, who is head of, and I need to read here, head of Urban and Rural Policy Unit and deputy head of Regional Development and Multi-Level Governance Division at the Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions, and Cities at the OECD. Enrique has really outstanding track record of research and policy work on all aspects of regional growth, a really long list of academic publications. So he's really expert on all different aspects of regional development, and we are really happy to have him with us today. So Enrique, Alessandra, you have probably about, I would say, 6 to 7 minutes. Ladies first. Alessandra, you start and pass the floor to Enrique, please. Welcome.
Thank you, Alexandra, very much. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are connected from. Yes, I'm not because I'm the head of the Trento Centre, I'm a fan of the SPL, but I'm really delighted to welcome you at this meeting of the OECD Spatial Productivity Lab for Friends, SPL. And as Alexandra said, that today we will explore the link between the quality of regional institutions and productivity. I don't think it's really worth it to say how important are institutions and regional institutions to really support the development, the growth of a place, but also provide well-being, ensure well-being and inclusion in places. So this is really a very fascinating and important topic. Well, as many of you know, but for those who are new in this meeting, the SPL works really in a very close cooperation with its partners to develop knowledge and also to understand the drivers of productivity at subnational level. And in doing so, we aim to provide governments, so not only with thorough analysis of economic trends and their effects on productivity performance of regions, but also to support them with policy advice on really the ways to boost growth and well-being. So this is what we really try to do. And as I said, with the SPL work, we don't do this together, but we do this with a number of partners representing universities and institutions that are helping us really to push the knowledge on this, push ahead the knowledge on this topic. As said already today, we have a fantastic lineup of speakers, and we are really looking forward to listen to them. But before doing so, I invite Enrique, my colleague, Enrique Garcilaso, to also give his welcome. And he is the deputy, as Alexandra said already, the deputy head of this important division within the Center for SME Regions and Cities, which deals precisely with regional development and multi-level governance. So he's really the right person to be with us today. So Enrique, the floor is yours. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, and I'm very pleased to be here today because, of course, this topic between the links on institutions and regional productivity is at the core, not just of our work, but of our committee. You know, the Regional Development Policy Committee has been actually working a lot on this topic, trying to make a blend between what is a governance and institutions and the performance of regions. This topic brings me back some memories, actually. You know, when I first started working at the OECD about 16, 17 years ago, we were working on this report on spatially blind and place-based policies with the World Bank and the OECD. And I remember at some point, the World Bank produced these maps of density, arguing that the world is pretty much flat and it has these peaks on the cities. And I think we kind of started to look at the distributions of productivity. And then all of a sudden we started to see that the world is not that flat. You know, when you look at the productivity and productivity growth spatially, you see that there's a lot of hills and mountains in between the places. So it's a very fascinating topic to try to understand, you know, the factors and the drivers of productivity. And if we look at the overall figures, we see that on average productivity tends to be higher on metro, on urban areas than on low density. So you do find that these agglomeration benefits have something to do with that. But I think what's interesting is that when you go away from the city, you get a lot more variation. You find like places that have high and low productivity. So there's something else beyond the agglomeration effect. And of course, when we look at the institutional factors, we find that across the OECD, there's about 141 subnational governments and entities that are playing a very important role on local and regional development. So try to shed out what the interaction is between these governance and also not just the institutional, but also the policy design, how investments are designed, implemented, and so forth. It's quite fascinating. In our division, we have two dedicated units working on exactly on this topic. One is on the governance and strategic planning, and the other one is on decentralization, subnational finance, and infrastructure. So for us, it's a very, very important topic. So we're very happy to be here today and to learn a bit what comes out of the discussion. And just to highlight that, of course, we don't start from zero, and I'm very happy that Andres is here also with us today. In fact, you know, some long time ago, me and Andres wrote this paper trying to make the link between the quality of governance and the impact on structural and cohesion funds. And what we found already on that paper is that governance is indeed very important, but especially in very lagging places. I think, you know, what we found is when the cohesion policies go beyond a certain level, it's really the quality of government that matters. Then perhaps also just to finalize some studies that we did some years ago, trying to look at the links between governance or fragmentation on metropolitan growth. And I think, you know, the urban team, they made this very strong link that show that if you reduce the level of fragmentation in a metropolitan area, the productivity gains, if you reduce it by half, the productivity gains go up on average about 6%. So I remember we did some estimates looking at metropolitan reforms for the case of France, and I think those results, they even reach the chief economist at that time. So I think, you know, the impact and the effects of this analysis is extremely relevant and policy relevant, I would say. So we're very excited to find out more. Of course, a lot more can be done on this area. We would like to push researchers and young brains of tomorrow to really put their efforts. There's a lot of work around formal and informal institutions. There's a lot of work about getting better data, not just on the institutional fronts, but on the investment side, on expenditures, revenues, and debt. In fact, in our area, that's what we've been trying to work on a lot, trying to work on the effects of regionalization reforms, finance, and so forth. So we're very keen on developing databases and evidence, but of course we also would welcome external researchers to to put their efforts into this area. So very much looking forward to the discussion today. Back to you, Alexandra.
Thank you, Enrique. Actually, you are in the right place. We will be touching on quite a few things that you highlighted in your intervention. Coming to the structure of the seminar, first I need to say that chat is actually disabled. I said earlier that comments can be shared in chat. Now, if you have something to share, use Q&A. And now the webinar, we follow the structure that we had last time online. We have three different blocks, three 20-minute blocks, each of them looking at specific dimension of the today's topic, which is again the link between institutions and regional productivity. We are starting with the big question, so do they matter? I think Enrique already gave us quite a bit of, spoiler alert here. Yes, they do. And we would have Andres Rodriguez-Pozey and Victor Lapuente to highlight and talk about this dimension. Then we go into kind of, trying to expand the picture. So is it only quality of government, or are there other dimensions that are interacting, and we need a broader view of different configurations that happen to be in place? And finally, again, as I said before to my colleagues, we would like to look more specifically into the mechanisms. And there are plenty of possible mechanisms. Time doesn't allow us to look at all of them, but we would look at just one, performance of SMEs, because they do constitute the chunk of our economies. And it is really important to understand what helps them to be more productive, to grow, just because, smaller companies, they have to rely on outside factors much more compared to bigger firms. So with that, we are ready to go into our first block, which will tell us whether government quality increases regional productivity. We have our main contribution by Andres Rodriguez-Pozey, who doesn't need much introduction here. I think he is Princesa Asturias chair and professor of economic geography at London School of Economics in the United Kingdom. So Andreas, you have about 12 minutes. Then Victor Lapuente. Okay, I already said to my speakers that I will be introducing from the very beginning. Victor Lapuente, he is a senior researcher and professor at the University of Gothenburg. And he also doesn't need any introductions for anybody working with the European Quality of Government Index, as he is one of the authors. So we are really, really pleased and honored to have you today with us. Andres, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Alexandra. It's my pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank the Spatial Productivity Lab and the OECD Centre at Trento. And I'm really happy to be here in such good company. It's not just you, Alexandra, and the other Alexandra, but also Enrique, who's someone who I admire a lot and a good friend, but also having people like Victor Lapuente as my discussant, to whom I owe and his team much of the research I've been doing, because they have provided the basic data that allows us to measure the impact of institutional quality. And I hope I'm not going to give too many spoilers on what I think is going to be a very nice presentation by Dylan Yong coming later. So if you can move to the slides. I'm going to start by highlighting the whole idea of the productivity challenge. And if you can move to the next one. In Europe, we have a significant productivity challenge in which probably for the best of 3 decades, Europe has had a lower productivity growth than most other places in the world, which is the United States or other advanced economies. We're clearly below the world level, and we are especially below mostly since the 2000s on emerging markets. And if you move to the next slide, so this is something that has been pervasive. We are below other places of the world. This is it's becoming structural, that we have been declining relative to the rest of the world since at least the 1990s, and is linked to some structural factors of our societies, like aging, lack of labor market reforms in many parts of Europe that are key factors stunting productivity growth. And what I'm going to try to argue that one of the key drivers of this is institutional problems, and therefore unlocking institutional issues, improving institutional quality might be a solution that has been somewhat overlooked until now of this challenge. So if we go to the next slide, the problem that I have highlighted a moment ago is one that engulfs the whole of Europe. But within Europe, at a regional level, what we have found is that there are very important differences in terms of productivity growth. This map looks at regional changes in productivity growth between the early 2000s and 2015. And we can see that there are areas, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, all the way from Poland down through the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Romania, until Bulgaria, where there has been significant productivity catch up. These are areas that started from very low levels and have caught up, especially since they became members of the European Union. But across the rest of Europe, we have also considerable differences. We have intermediate levels of productivity growth in Denmark, in Sweden, in most of the Iberian Peninsula, and significant differences in countries like Ireland, where you have the south, and Dublin with high productivity growth, but the northwest of the country, places like Donegal, for example, with very low productivity growth, and significant contrast in the UK. So Yorkshire with very low productivity growth, somewhat higher in Scotland. But in many parts of Europe, in many regions, especially regions that have been caught for a long time in a so-called development trap, many areas of Greece, the majority of Italy, with very few exceptions, Basilicata and to a lesser extent, Alto Adige and Lombardy, but also areas around Paris and some of the richest areas in Germany, like, for example, Hessen or parts of Bavaria, where productivity has really been stunned. And why is that? And if we can go to the next slide, this is something that we can see from what has happened in how we measure productivity. Traditionally, we have measured productivity looking at what we have on my screen right in the center. It has been a factor that was linked to 3 dimensions. How much physical capital do you have? How much human capital do you have? What is your component of technology and innovation? And of course, the structure of the labor market. And on top of that, we have that interrogation sign, which is the error term, the residual factor, what we didn't explain with those 4 factors: human capital, innovation, physical capital, and labor market structure. What has happened over time? And then we have to look at the right-hand side of our screen, in which you can see that when we are trying to measure the factors that drive productivity, physical capital, human capital, and technology explain far less of the story of what are the drivers of productivity in recent years in Europe. And what has grown has fundamentally been the residual factor, the error term. So what we didn't know has become higher. And if we go to the next slide, what I'm going to argue is that this has been driven by one missing link in most productivity analysis. And this is work that comes from the work that has been done at the Gothenburg University Quality of Government Institute, where Victor, my discussant, is going to be, is actually based, in which we look at differences in quality of government across Europe, in which we can see significant, not just national, but subnational differences. We have a corner in the southeast of Europe with relatively low quality of government, covering from the south of Italy through Croatia, parts of Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Greece. Areas with very good quality of government, which include the whole of the Nordic countries, but most of Germany, parts of Austria, the whole of the Netherlands, and parts of Ireland and Western France. And then somewhere in between, we have the Iberian Peninsula, which is around the average. So blue colors are above the average. Ochre colors and red colors are below the average. And also the northern part of Central and Eastern Europe, all the way from Slovakia to Estonia, in which we are starting to have some regions, Estonia, but also Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania, where the quality of government is now above the average. And I think that the hypothesis in this paper that I have developed with, and that was published recently in the Journal of Economic Geography with Roberto Ganao from the University of Padua, is that when you plug institutional quality and variations in institutional quality across regions of Europe, you'll have a significant direct and indirect impact on differences in productivity. So we can go to the next slide, please. And these are the results of the analysis, so please go to the next slide. I'm not going to present, because Alessandra told me don't present any sort of regressions. I just present the results of the analysis. And what about the direct impact? When you not just consider human capital, physical capital, and technology plus labor market structure, but you also the quality of government of the regions of Europe. And we do that for 250, almost 250, 248 regions across Europe. What we find is actually very, very strong and very stark. That once you control for all those other factors, we get a far stronger impact of institutional quality on changes in productivity over a decade and a half than that of physical and human capital. That in a period in which productivity hasn't grown, this actually lack of productivity growth, lack of dynamism in terms of productivity is fundamentally linked to variations in institutional quality. That, of course, this varies according to the method, but 1 unit increase in government quality at the regional level leads to an estimated, and this is the best case scenario, 52% increase in labor productivity growth. Whichever method we use, it's always positive and significant. The lowest level of returns we get is 19%, the highest is 52. So what we are saying that improvements in productivity might be a significant direct driver and a very important one of increases in quality of government, of increases in productivity. And that the regions that have managed to improve the quality of government the most are those that have experienced over the period of analysis the greatest increases in productivity. But if we go to the next slide, the influence of quality of government and institutional quality on productivity is not just limited to a direct effect. It also affects the returns indirectly of the other factors that drive changes in productivity: physical capital, human capital, and innovation and technology. And what we get is that in terms of physical capital, in fact, the relationship is negative. Better quality of government reduces the returns of marginally, but it does, of investment in physical infrastructure. But in terms of human capital and technology and innovation, we find the opposite, that if your institutional quality, your government quality is in the top quintile, it undermines, or quartile here, it undermines significantly the impact that improvements in human capital, improvements in technology and innovation may have on productivity growth. By contrast, you get the biggest returns and significant increases when what you do is you have areas with significantly higher institutional quality of government that are in the top quartile, above the average. It depends on whether you're looking at human capital and or innovation. So if we go to the next one, what we can conclude from this, and please pass to the next slide, thank you very much, is that yes, institutions matter, and they matter a lot for productivity changes, at least at the regional level in Europe. That regions in Europe are facing, to different extents and different degrees, a productivity challenge that is limiting not just growth, but also employment generation and, to a certain extent, also innovation. That this challenge is greatest for many of those regions that are in intermediate levels of development, but that have been unable to grow, that are caught in what is increasingly known as a development trap. And that one of the main problems for these regions is that they are becoming less capable than they were before in making the most of any type of investment in human capital and innovation potential. And institutions are at the heart of this problem. They represent a direct barrier to increase in productivity, but indirectly they inhibit the returns of investments in human capital and innovation. Therefore, if we're going to deal with productivity, we need to focus on institutions, on quality of government, and within that, specifically on the problems of lack of transparency and accountability and high levels of corruption, which seem to me the main culprits behind a problem in which institutions stunt and seriously stunt productivity growth across Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andreas. I will pass the floor to Victor right now. We also have a question which actually looks quite suitable probably for your presentation. I do not know if you are going to cover it, but if it is tangent, you may mention. The question goes like this. What are the most important differences in institutional quality within countries? Often institutional quality is quite homogeneous within the same country. So in case you are going to overview the index a little bit and you know kind of what the distributions are within countries, you can highlight it. But again, no pressure here. Probably.
Alexandra, I'm very happy to answer that question. But
okay,
I think
please.
No, but we can probably, because I mean, the index is also being connected to the work that Victor has done. We can probably answer the question together. And yes, it's going to highlight that in some countries, institutions and institutional quality and quality of government is very similar across the country. That's mainly in places like the Nordics. But the more you go down the scale, internal differences are big and they can be extremely high, especially in the case of Italy. But I think it's probably best if Victor does his intervention, and we can probably together answer the question, because I think Victor, as responsible for the index, one of the persons responsible for that, has probably as much, if not more, to say about the index and differences in institutional quality within Europe and within countries of Europe.
I think you have replied very well the question, Andres, and thank you very much, Alessandra. Yeah, thank you to the OECD Trento Centre and to give me the opportunity to talk a little bit more than be a discussion of Andres' great work. I'm going to be a complement or support to what already he has said. If we can go to the slides. Thank you. Yeah, well, quality of government is actually very important and normally has been studied as absence of corruption. That is traditionally how it was studied and measured, and it's highly correlated, the absence of corruption, the control of corruption, the fact that institutions in a country act in an impartial way is highly correlated with any kind of indicator of social well-being in a society, human development index, like here, environmental protection, life satisfaction and happiness. Everything seems to be correlated with absence of corruption or other indicators of quality of government. If we can go to the next slide, thanks. But most of the data so far for many years have been at least at the national level. We know from the work of Robert Putnam and Tabellini in Italy, for example, that there are important subnational differences, but we have not studied them much, or we have not inquired them much. So working together with the EU Commission, DG Regio, we have been undertaking this citizen survey in 4 rounds to form this European Quality of Government Index, looking at units NUTS 1 or NUTS 2, ranging from at the beginning 200 to now over 400 or 500 respondents per region. And in this round, we have 129,000 respondents in a total of 208 NUTS 1 and NUTS 2 regions of the European Union. And next slide, please. And what we ask, well, we ask about 3 different sets of questions related with core theoretical or normative issues in quality of government, impartiality, so to which extent citizens think that they are treated impartially by the public institutions operating in the region. That's very important, not that belong to the regional government, but operating in the region. The same institution might operate differently in, for example, a northern Italian region than a southern Italian region. Second place, corruption, well, if there is public abuse for private gain. And in the third place, which is the perception the citizens have on the quality of the services or the government effectiveness. If we can go to the next slide, please. And then we ask perceptions and also the experience that the citizens have on this case, corruption, if they have been asked to pay a bribe or to give an informal gift, or when they go to the doctor, or when they go to the school. So in law enforcement, healthcare, and education, in these three areas, we ask questions on perceptions and experience, and then we put them all together to form this EQI, European Quality of Government Index. We can go to the next slide, please. So this is the first one we got in the first round, and it was just in the aftermath of the financial crisis. Regions is very similar to what you already have seen by Andres. So we see a difference between East and West. Now the differences between the East and the West have been narrowed. So there is not such a wide gap there. There are many Central and Eastern European regions that have been catching up in quality of government, and we can see that if we move to the next slide, please. How this is the 2021, the last round, we see differences in the perceptions of quality of government, and as we can see, there are wide variations within each country. We can go to the next slide. We can see this precisely what Andres was mentioning before. So we can see in countries like, for example, Nordic countries, Finland and Denmark, but small countries, but also Germany, which is a large country with also, in theory, heterogeneous regions, but still the differences are not very wide. But if we move towards eastern part of Europe and southern part of Europe, we start to see larger differences in France. We see larger difference in Spain, and of course, the largest differences are in Italy. But all in all, what we can see in the evolution from 2009 until now is we would say Italianization of many countries, in the sense that there are more widespread differences in many countries. We can see that in the next slide, which corresponds to the case of Spain. You see the same two regions topping at the top and the bottom of the Spanish Quality of Government Index, the Basque Country at the top, both in 2010 and now, and Catalonia at the bottom in both cases, which is also an interesting comparison. Why two relatively similar regions with nationalist feeling, with their own language, have been traditionally the two industrial engines of Spain. One is at the top and the other is at the bottom. But the differences, all in all, in the regions have become even wider the more. So there is no convergence, at least within countries, but in some countries you can see a divergence. And just the last slides that I have very briefly are just about the consequences, and that Andres has studied much better this. We, in some of the papers we have done, we have pointed out, like here, a strong correlation, just bivariate correlation between quality of government and lots of indicators of economic inequality, gender inequality, social trust, education, health. We see a strong bivariate correlations, but if we move to the next slide, we can see a summary of some of the research, starting with this fantastic work by Rodríguez Pose and Enrique Garcilaso. And when we can say that, well, correlation might also be causation, or at least there seems to be a very strong statistical association between this index of quality of government and lots of indicators of well-being. Here I include not only the ones related with the economy, like informal economy, degree of innovation, small business creation, where I also have been working with Marina Istoskaya and Nicolas Charron, but also more efficient use of the EU structural funds, better implementation of smart specialization, higher rates of political gender equality, and also higher levels of social capital and social trust, together with lower rates of support for populist parties. This is something that has been studied for a few years, but probably the one who has popularized the most is precisely Andrés Rodríguez Posse with his idea of the regions that don't matter. But even we can see, we did a large correlation of lots of factors related with the abuse of antibiotics and controlling for health indicators of health expenditure and many things. Bjorn Ronnestrand and I found a strong association between quality of government and less use, that is less abuse of antibiotics in the regions, particularly the situation of antibiotics. The abuse of antibiotics is particularly strong in the southern European regions that combine a relatively decent level of GDP per capita, so purchase per capita that people can allow to buy antibiotics with very or quite low levels of quality of government. So it seems the quality of government matters a lot. And the Lancet, like 2 weeks ago, was pointing out that the perceptions of quality of government seem to matter also for the rates of infections and the deaths related to COVID-19, something that Andrés Rodríguez Posse and Nicolas Charron also have been dealing in a paper that is going to be out in European Journal of Political Research in the very next few weeks. So it seems to be related with many things, not only with the economy. And I stop here, and we will willing to respond, address any question related with the index or its consequences later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Victor. Thank you, Andres. Andres, there are a few questions in the Q&A. If you could just type maybe answers, because we are running a little bit behind right now. We are ready to go to the next slot, in a sense. So we learned that quality of government is linked to increased productivity, and changing quality of government actually has hope for weaker regions in terms of growth. We also learned that there are plenty of other dimensions that quality of government can affect. And right now, we would like to expand the view a little bit more. Is it only quality of government, or is there something else that is at work? I would like to invite Dylan Young, who is postdoctoral researcher at the University of Groningen. Dylan spent a little bit of time actually here in Trento with us, and work that he's presenting today was started here. So we are very proud of this work. His intervention will be commented by Charles Seaford, who is senior researcher at DEMAS. But he's also part of a LIPSIT project, which stands for Local Institutions, Productivity, Sustainability, and Inclusivity Trade-offs. It is a consortium of researchers from different universities that try to understand how regional institutional and organizational arrangements leading to the good management of policy trade-offs linked to productivity. So at least he can reflect on Dylan's findings as it applies to United Kingdom, which, as has been already mentioned, is one of the countries with very high differences in productivity performance across regions. Dylan, the floor is yours. Welcome. Dylan, your mic, I think, got disconnected. We can hardly hear you.
Is it not working, or?
Yep, now better.
Please let me know if it turns bad. Yeah. But yeah, I'm happy to be here, honored to be part of this great lineup, and I will spend some time on broadening our view on government quality. So is it only government quality that matters? And I've been taught that if there's a question mark in the title, then the answer is always no. But there was also a question mark in the first part of this meeting today, and there the answer was yes. So I guess that no longer holds. But in my case, it is no. There are more factors that are relevant, so I want to share them with you today. So if we could go to the next slide. Yeah, so this is also published as a paper at the OECD. So if you want more information about the methods or more implications, please have a look there. Hopefully I can enthusiase you to have a look at the paper. But I will start now. So please, next slide. Yeah, so what I will do here is have a look at not only quality of government, but also decentralization and horizontal fragmentation. And I will argue that actually their importance is sort of linked together. They're intertwined, and there are significant interactions between the three factors. So I wanted to start off by highlighting the importance of quality of government, but clearly that is not necessary anymore, because the previous discussion has very adequately shown that the importance of quality of government. So I'll just leave it at that, but we also use the European Quality of Government Index, so that's the EQI that you see there. Then decentralization, which is there's more debate on the economic implications of decentralization. There's quite a strong debate on the implications of decentralization. There are arguments in favor of decentralization and against. There's empirical evidence on the economic effects of decentralization, but the results are sort of mixed or inconclusive. So we still don't know, and there are very vocal discussions on that. So we want to include that here as well, and I will say a bit more about that later. And then the third one, Enrique actually highlighted the importance of fragmentation already. OECD has a paper on that as well, and generally they find that horizontal fragmentation has a negative effect or negative economic implications, and we include that in our sort of multidimensional approach as well, and we investigate what the effects are in terms of GDP per worker or urban labor productivity. So if you could go to the next slide. Right, so this is how they are measured. Again, the European Quality of Government Index, I don't think needs more information. The Local Autonomy Index is what we use to capture decentralization. There are multiple pillars below this index. I will not go into detail on these separate pillars because of time constraints, but there is more information about that in the paper, which I think might also be relevant for those interested. And then horizontal fragmentation, where we capture that in terms of the number of local governments within each functional urban area after factoring out population effects. So basically, how fragmented are these governmental entities in functional urban areas that we see? So could we, next slide, please? Yeah, so this is then what we will do is that we have these three separate governance factors or pillars, let's say, but not only do we estimate their direct effects on urban labor productivity, but also their interaction effects. And the basic argument that we make is that within the discussion on the economic effects of decentralization, a lot of the arguments make an implicit assumption about the quality of government. The general idea about decentralization is that it's good because at the local level, the local governments have a better understanding of the local needs and can better cater to those local needs. You know, someone in Amsterdam has different needs than someone in Schagen, where I'm from originally, for example. So they can, you know, play into those specific needs better than the central government could do. There are a lot of arguments there, but what we say is that implicitly, a lot of these arguments make an assumption about the quality of local government, right? That the local government is non-corrupt, is very effective or efficient in providing the services that they are responsible for, right? And so if you're in favor of decentralization, you're making the assumption that the quality of government is high enough to do that and to capture those sort of potential, the economic potential. And if you're maybe perhaps more opposed to decentralization, you might be more inclined to having arguments that local governments do not have sufficient quality to overcome certain efficiency issues, for example. So that's the background idea. Actually, Andres sort of Exposa also has a paper on that. So we're also building on that work as well. And then horizontal fragmentation is there. We have some controls, and that's sort of what the model looks like, but more information in the paper itself, of course. So if we could go to the next slide. This is what the estimation results look like in a table. I will visualize this also in another way, but just to very quickly show, if we focus on the last column on the right-hand side, we see in red the direct effects. So we see a negative effect for decentralization overall. We see a positive effect of quality of government, luckily in line with the previous discussion, and an insignificant effect for fragmentation. And then we see some interaction effects and also the triple interaction effects in yellow. But what I want to focus on here briefly is that the EQI interaction with LAI, so government quality with decentralization, is positive. And that's in line with the argument we were making that the decentralization effect might be positive if you have a higher quality of government, or the other way around is also possible, that you're getting more economic benefit from your positive quality of government if the local governments actually have some sort of power. So that's the idea. And this is visualized in the next slide in a different way. So here we see the marginal decentralization effect and captured by LAI, again, local autonomy units, right? So if we look at the bottom, at the horizontal axis, we see horizontal fragmentation. And then we see 3 lines which represent the 3 different levels of quality of government. The blue line is low government quality, red line is medium government quality, and the green line is high government quality. And what we first of all see is that these 3 lines converge up to the point 0 as horizontal fragmentation becomes higher, right? So at the righter part of the graph, the lines come together on around 0, so the effect of increasing decentralization becomes insignificant, basically. So only when horizontal fragmentation is sufficiently low do we find significant effects for increasing decentralization, right? And the biggest standout line that we have here is the blue line, which shows that when government quality is low, increasing your decentralization has a strong negative economic effect, right? As government quality gets higher, so the red line, for example, is medium government quality, still increasing decentralization has a slight negative urban productivity effect. Only when government quality is high, which is the green line, and horizontal fragmentation is low, relatively low, do we see a positive effect for increasing decentralization. So basically, the effect of decentralization depends on the government quality and horizontal fragmentation. If we could go to the next slide, please. We see a similar graph from the same estimations, but then highlighting the government quality effect. So here we have the degree of decentralization on the horizontal axis, and we see a similar thing, that if the degree of decentralization is low, all these lines converge, and the effect of government quality basically becomes insignificant as well. Only when the degree of decentralization is sufficiently large do we see significant effects for government quality. And we see the biggest positive effect for government quality when fragmentation is relatively low and the degree of decentralization is relatively high, as evidenced by the blue line going up to the right. Can we go to the next slide, please? So we can illustrate these implications for 3 cities. We basically estimated the overall governance, the predicted governance effect from our estimations for all cities that we included in our data set. We came to a ranking, and then Helsinki was found to be, having the best, let's say, governance structure, at least predicted by the model. Of course, you have to make some caveats with that, and more on that is also in the paper. But Helsinki is on top, Prague is somewhere in the middle, and then Radom is somewhere at the bottom. But if we look at their specific EQI, LAI, and horizontal fragmentation values, so the government quality, decentralization, and horizontal fragmentation, we see that Radom and Prague actually have a very similar quality of government value. The difference between the two is in their level of decentralization and horizontal fragmentation. So for Radom, there's quite relatively high decentralization value, relatively low horizontal fragmentation value, whereas in Prague, decentralization is medium and horizontal fragmentation is very high. Now, if you, as we've just interpreted in the graphs, as horizontal fragmentation becomes larger, the negative effect of a relatively lower government quality is also negated. It becomes sort of insignificant. So basically, the negative effect of the relatively low government quality value in Radom is translated into a negative economic effect simply because the government there has more power, local government has more power, and they're not as fragmented. Now, if we compare Radom also with Helsinki, we see that their decentralization value is very similar. Their horizontal fragmentation value is also very similar, but the government quality value is very different. And there it shows that with this governance structure in terms of decentralization and horizontal fragmentation, you get the biggest sort of marginal effect out of government quality. So if government quality is high, you get a big economic productivity effect out of that. But if it's relatively low, you get a negative effect out of that. So we calculate or estimated using the model that Radom could potentially increase its productivity by 58% if it would go to the government quality level of Helsinki. And I think that also links quite well with the estimation by Andres earlier that he showed. But conversely, if Prague would increase its government quality to that level of Helsinki, the effect would be negligible because the local governments have far less power and they're too fragmented to capture that effect. Yeah, could we go to the next slide, please? Right, so what I've been trying to show is that there is a need for a comprehensive view for taking into account these sort of interactions between these factors. So the labor productivity effects of government quality, decentralization, and fragmentation are interdependent. And in order to enhance your labor productivity, different elements of this combination might need to be adjusted depending on your context. So for example, in the UK, where cities generally have high government quality and low horizontal fragmentation, it might pay off to increase local autonomy. Whereas in France, there's generally high government quality, although there's some regional differences, and more decentralization or local autonomy, it might pay off to decrease the relatively high horizontal fragmentation to capture these economic potential. And overall, the most productive urban areas tend to have high government quality, high decentralization, and low fragmentation. So that's it for me. I think the next slide shows that. Yeah, thank you. And I think I'll just give the floor to Charles Seifert directly. Is that okay? Yeah.
Yes, please. Charles, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you very much, Dylan. That was a fascinating presentation. I just thought there's people in Prague who want to get up to Helsinki standards must be very, very frustrated anyway. So it was fascinating. That was a fascinating analysis. I am a senior fellow at Demos, but I'm actually presenting from the perspective of a research project that Alexandra mentioned, which was conducted by academics from 4 universities, Birmingham, Warwick, Cardiff and Surrey, as well as ourselves at Demos. So if you'd like to go on to the next slide. The comprehensive view that you put forward, Dylan, is very congruent with our overall conclusion, that we called it a need for strong local institutions. But we didn't just mean by that the quality of those institutions. We meant the institutions that have good quality, that's to say good people working for them above all, and good systems and all the rest of it. Accountability, because accountability is the mechanism that keeps them having good quality, but also coherent decision rights. Because in the examples we looked at, and incidentally our focus was entirely within the UK, in examples we looked at, confused decision rights was absolutely killed efforts to raise productivity. And so these things, I think you can see, do sort of map on to the variables that you were looking at. Obviously, quality is quality, and accountability is a contributor to quality. And coherent decision rights relates to autonomy and to horizontal fragmentation. Because very often you find that there are boundaries between local authorities and who can't work together effectively, or in terms of that, which is the fragmentation side, or there are problems between central and local government about who has the authority to do what, and a total failure actually to get a coherent shared strategy in many instances. So the broad conclusion you come to is the same as the conclusion we came to. But I should add that our conclusion is not based simply on productivity growth, but on, as Alexander said, we were looking at the three different objectives one might have from economic policy: inclusivity, productivity, and sustainability. And we were looking at how do you, if you like, optimize the trade-offs. And therefore, we found that we were looking primarily at inclusive growth, and what structures and processes are necessary for inclusive growth. So it's a slight variation on what you said. So that's my first point, really, that there's a lot of congruence in what you said and what we found. I want to just make a point, though, about this thing about don't decentralize. Well, we didn't actually say this, but there's no point in decentralizing if the quality isn't sufficiently high. Because in the UK, that's an argument that's often used by officials in the central government against decentralizing. I mean, we may have better, you kindly said that the UK may have a better local institutions than some other countries, but it's very patchy, it's very inconsistent. And there's an argument that's regularly put that there's no point decentralizing. Because if you look at the average figures of the kind you described, you'll see that decentralization doesn't work. And you'll see, and we know that a lot of these people are incompetent. And that's, I mean, there's some truth in those observations. But the problem is, you then get stuck. I mean, in terms of policy, it's hopeless, because what do you then do? They're not just going to get better by themselves, these organizations. So you need a coherent strategy for creating strong local institutions. And as I say, that involves those different elements. And if you have that strategy, then hopefully you can build up to the kind of institutions that is worth decentralizing to. But part of that strategy is indeed decentralization. So that's my second point. The third point I want to make, I'll go on to the next slide, is simply about why these factors matter. We did quite a lot of work interviewing people and doing some literature review and so on, including, I should say, the OECD's work on this, which we found exceptionally useful. And the point about these different structural features is that they facilitate what we call policy success factors. In order to get a region or a city or an area to grow faster, particularly if it's stuck in a low skills equilibrium, if it's a low productivity area, you have a whole range of policies, but underpinning those policies are these four success factors: coordination, partnership, local capability and knowledge, and accountability. I mean, the reasons for these are in a sense fairly clear. It's not terribly controversial. Coordination, because there are a lot of different levers you have to pull, and if people are pulling levers in different offices and not talking to each other, which often happens, then it doesn't work very well. Partnership, because actually the public sector and the private sector need to work together. Capability and knowledge, which is not just knowing sort of what people want in that area and so forth, but it's actually understanding the business people in that area, understanding what they're capable of and what they're not capable of, and how they're likely to respond. And accountability, obviously, is a driver for performance. So I think you can see from these four success factors why the kind of things that Dylan was talking about are going to be important. Coordination, obviously, if you have too much fragmentation, not enough centralization, it's difficult. Not enough decentralization, it's difficult to coordinate. Partnership, no one's going to want to be a partner with you if you have no power, or if you're involved in too small an area of activity, or indeed if you're corrupt and incompetent. Local capability and knowledge, obviously, that's a fact that depends upon adequate decentralization. And accountability is clearly associated with quality. So that I think fits quite closely with what Dylan was saying. Can go on to the next slide, please. So we and these are sort of just the headlines, but we made a set of recommendations to UK government, very simply. Clarify decision rights, which would mean not too much. I mean, there's some tension, not too much enough decentralization, but not too much fragmentation. I mean, in the UK, we tried to sort of square this circle by having combined authorities and then local authorities and all kinds of other structures. But that just gets even worse. I mean, it just becomes, you have this baroque structure. Reform the funding system, because decentralization of decision rights doesn't really get you anywhere if you haven't got any money, which is what we have in the UK. Strengthen accountability, because hardly anybody in the UK at any rate knows who's responsible for what. So there's no real democratic accountability for local economic policy, and that's a disaster. And strengthen capabilities, make sure we have good people, because it's very, very variable. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Love the presentations, and thank you, Dylan. Of course, I love it how we go from, you know, what data shows us in academic research to actually what can be done to really decrease the regional productivity differences. So we are rushing a little bit because we're a little bit behind. I would like to go to our mechanisms section. Here we have two female speakers. I apologize. Maria Rosario Agostina will present her recent work on the productivity of SMEs and how it varies depending on the quality of government in Italian regions. And Maria Rosario is associate professor at the Department of Economics, Statistics and Finance at the University of Calabria here in Italy. And Alessandra Russo, who is my colleague, she's economist and policy analyst, will be offering some insights from her work where she looks at the ability of SMEs to scale up and whether outside factors, including institutions, are linked to it. Maria Rosario, the floor is yours, 12 minutes, and Alexandra, you go for about 7 afterwards, please.
Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you very much. I wish to thank all the Spatial Productivity Lab for this great opportunity to meet experts in this field. So thank you. I'm very glad. I'm very delighted to be here. And today, my presentation will focus on the relationship between local institutional quality and small firms productivity. Please, we can go to the next slide. Empirical studies on the relationship between local institution and firms productivity are not numerous, and they tend to confirm a positive direct influence of institutional quality on firms productivity, which can be traced back to more secure legal framework, well-defined legal framework, lower transaction costs, and higher incentives to invest in human capital and physical capital, higher incentive to innovate. Even less numerous are the number of works that investigate how local institutions interplay with firm characteristics or with characteristics of the environment where firms operate. And today, I'm summarizing a study which belongs to this trend of literature, carried out with my colleagues, Di Tommaso, Nifo, Rubini, and Trivieri. In this work, we highlight the need to consider both direct and moderating effects of institutional quality, because different characteristics, different abilities of firms to deal with the institutional context should matter a lot, especially for small businesses, which are deeply rooted in their geographical area. In other words, we expect that local institution, we expect institutional quality to interact with environments and firms' characteristics. However, this interaction, the sign of this interaction, is an open question. We can go to the next slide, please. Indeed, local institutional quality can be regarded as in a broad sense, as a particular kind of input, which can be either a complement or a substitute for favorable characteristics of the firms or the economic environment where the firms operate. Let me consider the case of human capital as an example. According to the complementarity hypothesis, a highly educated workforce should better exploit the opportunities provided by a better institutional context. On the other hand, according to the substitution hypothesis, good institution could be regarded as a sort of positive externality, which is particularly important for firms with lower human capital. More generally, if institutional qualities complement to favorable characteristics of the firms, the most capable firms should mostly benefit from a good institutional environment. By contrast, if institutional qualities tend to substitute for the lack of some favorable condition, we should observe a decreasing influence of institutional quality on total factor productivity when conditioning on these factors. To shed some light on this open empirical question, we use firm level data. Please go to the next slide. We draw some firm level data from the EFIGE survey, which provides a measure of total factor productivity for about 6,500 manufacturing small businesses. We consider as small and medium-sized enterprises those hiring less than 250 employees. These firms are based in 7 European countries: Austria, France, Germany, Hungary, Italy, Spain, and UK. We focus on small businesses as they are regarded as an important engine of economic growth, employment generation, and because they should be more affected by the local institutional context. As a measure of a regional level institutional endowment, we also use the European Quality of Government Index and 2 components, rule of law and government effectiveness. Please go to the next slide. Since our firms are nested in regions, we adopt a multi-level approach, and we make the relationship between local institutional quality and total factor productivity as conditional. We model this relationship as conditional on firms' characteristics, such as age, size, human capital, the technological level of the industrial sector, the economic performance of the region, proxied by the regional GDP. Moreover, to allow the impact of our key regressors to be different according to the different segments of the total factor productivity distribution, we employ a quantile regression. Please, we can go to the next slide. So what we find is that first, there is a positive impact of institution on firms' total factor productivity, and this results is in line with those provided by the literature in this field. Moreover, we find that good institution seems to matter more for less endowed firms, less productive, smaller, younger, less human capital intensive firms, and those operating in less technological advanced industries. To give an idea, the impact of local institutional quality for larger firms is about 60% of the impact exerted on other firms. But I have to highlight that in line with some evidence in this field, local institutional quality can explain a minor share of total factor productivity heterogeneity, even in our sample. However, our analysis shows that local institutions can partially offset the lack of some favorable conditions. So even though the direct effect of the institutional quality is limited compared to that of other drivers of productivity, we have to take into account the moderating role of the institutional quality, which seems to work through several channels. So before concluding with some policy implications, Let me acknowledge that, of course, our study has some limitations. For example, we don't account for unobserved firms heterogeneity, as we are not using a panel of data. But having said that, according to our evidence, it seems that better institutions might be particularly important for weaker enterprises. So promoting institutional improvement at the local level could translate into an investment for building future winners rather than picking the winners. Please, the last slide. Before leaving the stage to my discussant, I'd like to add that these findings are consistent with other findings of ongoing research based on enterprise surveys from the World Bank. We are investigating the relationship of between local institution and innovation activity in a large sample of transition countries. And once again, so far we have found that good institutions, especially rule of law, seem associated with a higher probability of innovating, in particular for less endowed firms. Again, better institution seems to generate a sort of rising tide lifts all boat effect, which mostly benefit less capable enterprises. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Maria Rosario. I think it was quite inspiring. Gives a lot of hope where to look if somebody wants to help all companies or struggling companies and weaker performing regions. Alexandra, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. And it's an honor to have been invited to this panel. I would like to first summarize what I found the most interesting and thought-provoking results from Maria Rosario's presentation. Can I get to my first slide, please? So these are, first of all, we've seen time and again in the presentations today that better institutions seem to lead to better firm outcomes, in particular, more productive firms. From Maria Rosario's presentation, we also saw that better institutions seem to matter more for less productive firms, for weaker firms, for younger firms, and for less technologically advanced firms. And seeing all of these results and seeing this, the fact that better institutions seem to have this higher tide lifts all boats effect, I want to propose two mechanisms that could explain this dynamic. Next slide, please. The one is entrepreneurship and the other one is innovation. And those are two, what we know from the literature, are very, very important mechanisms that lead to higher productivity. Next slide, please. I'd like to start with entrepreneurship. So a lot of the work on entrepreneurship has been done also at the national level and somehow less at the regional level, also due to data issues. Now, we know in any case that there seems to be somehow a U-shaped relationship between economic development and entrepreneurship. At very low levels of economic development, you seem to have high entrepreneurship, but this is one of the reasons you see this is that there are little formal job opportunities. So in other words, one of the reasons you see this is that people are kind of need to be entrepreneurs because they cannot actually get a job in a company. As economic development increases, you see towards medium levels of development that actually there's a decrease in entrepreneurship. So you have lower entrepreneurship in medium development economies. And as economic development decreases, you see higher entrepreneurship. And this is a different effect, and that is because on the one hand, you have more capital in those economies, you have higher safety nets, but also you have a higher level of formal economy so that you can really observe this higher entrepreneurship. This is linked to what is called the opportunity versus necessity entrepreneurship. So necessity entrepreneurship occurs when you become an entrepreneur because you cannot because that's the only thing we can do. You cannot find other job opportunities. And opportunity entrepreneurship is when you become an entrepreneur because you have seen a possible good economic opportunity. From some of the very recent research, it seems that better institutions seem to increase opportunity entrepreneurship and decrease necessity. And corruption seems to decrease entrepreneurship across the board. Next slide, please. Now, how would this be consistent with what Maria Rosaria just showed us? Well, on the one hand, you have the story that better institutions can lead to more opportunities, can lead to more entrepreneurship. And in particular, it's more opportunity entrepreneurship, because if you have better institutions, you can have less necessity entrepreneurship because people can find more jobs. This could also be consistent with the effect that she finds on the stronger effects for the younger firms, for instance, or the stronger effects for firms where the job conditions are perhaps less attractive. So perhaps this, all of this concentration of the effect on the lower end of the productivity and the age distribution could be explained, for instance, that those people, as institutions become better, people that would have been perhaps, people would find better jobs, and then you would see only the better firms that are left in those areas. Another possible explanation, again, these are by no means, I think they're the only explanations and they're not exhaustive. Next slide, please. So another possible explanation is, or another possible mechanism is innovation. And again, from the literature, we know that better regional institutions can encourage innovation. On the one hand, you have high institutional capacity. And if you have high institutional capacity and a better prepared civil service, you can have better innovation policies, either because you can have more complex subsidy programs or a better taxation system, or because you can create better innovation networks, you have more money for universities, you can create more hubs, more tech parks, whatever you can think of. There's another effect though. Better institutions can also lead, we know from some of the literature, to less regulatory uncertainty. And if you have less uncertainty in general regarding how the government will act, this gives you more incentives to invest in innovation if you think you have a higher chance that you're going to obtain the fruits of your labor. Additionally, we know that if you have less corruption, you can have the entrepreneur themselves can keep more resources to themselves rather than give resources that would have been bribes for the various officials. This means that you have higher return to innovation, and in addition, you also have more resources to innovate. Better institutions can also lead to an impersonal application of the rule of law. This is what Victor was talking about the rule of law in the EQI, but this can also lead to, for instance, more contracts. If you can trust the law and you can trust the system, then you can reach out more widely to people and you can have more contracts with suppliers, with clients, whatever. And that means also more learning, for instance, and then perhaps more innovation. Finally, I think this could be an important reason why you see this kind of result on the lower end of the distribution. It suggested that larger and more established firms can better compensate for unfavorable regional institutional environments, as opposed to smaller firms, which are perhaps more impacted. This could explain why we see the younger and smaller firms being more sensitive to institutions because they have less resources to compensate for this impact. Thank you very much. I think that's my last slide.
Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you, Maria Rosaria. I think it was quite comprehensive overview of the possible mechanisms, and I'm pretty sure more can be done, and maybe more can be done from the viewpoint of Charles, specifically for policy, what it means, what do we have in place, what needs to be fixed, improved, you know, changed, so what we see can actually happen. I think we are done with the main part of our program. I'm very happy to invite Bart van Ark, who will be offering the concluding remarks. I think Bart wanted to share his slides. I don't know if it is still the case, Bart. Okay, I would like to ask to stop sharing and grant Bart sharing rights, I guess. Okay, and I need to introduce, of course, Bart. He is Professor of Productivity Studies at the University of Manchester and Managing Director and Principal Investigator at the Productivity Institute in the UK. So I can go forever about his accomplishments in terms of productivity, but I think we couldn't have a better person to wrap up this webinar. Bart, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Alexandra, and thanks for inviting me. A fascinating series of papers, and I think a really important topic. I think we have an increasingly better understanding of what drives productivity differences between countries. We have an increasingly, we still need more, but a better understanding of what drives productivity between firms. But it is this regional context where there's still a lot of work to be done, and indeed the ability to actually look at the institutional role of this, I think, is absolutely critical, not just from an analytical, but also from a policy perspective. As you told me that indeed I would only probably have less than the 10 minutes that I was allocated, I did put them on a slide, but I cannot share the screen as long as my picture is still up. So otherwise I will have to go through my notes if you colleagues can take that slide down. But it will be helpful because it will just speed up things if they could do that. But apparently it's not happening. So let me try and do this just then this way. So I think there's sort of 6 important implications that I hear from a policy perspective from this work. First of all, here it is. Thank you very much. If you don't mind, I'm going to do this right now. It just, I think, helps to speed things up a little bit. Here we go. And you should be able to see it right now. So first of all, I think a key takeaway is this, and it came, of course, most clearly through Andres' papers, but also on the other papers, is to make this distinction between the direct and the indirect effects. So yes, of course, institutional quality helps productivity, and I think everyone can be convinced of that. But it is really the indirect effects, the particular effects for human capital and for through innovation capacity and innovation capabilities that are really very important. And I think that linkage is important for policymakers to understand. I think an important policy implication from that is really metrics. We need to understand how these various aspects of institutional quality work through on productivity, on the creation of human capital, on the creation of institutional capacity. And I know that the Spatial Productivity Lab is already doing really good work, but having an agreed framework through which policymakers at a regional level can track these metrics will help them to understand the direct and the indirect effects. The second important comment, particularly, of course, for Diane's paper, is this critical interaction between government quality, decentralization, and fragmentation. And I think Diane actually said it very well. There's quite often sort of an implicit assumption that all this stuff is related. But in practice, I think what really needs to be done, it needs to be made explicit. So I think what is important for policymakers is to really understand what are the aspects of institutional quality that they care about, how does that relate to decentralization, and how does that relate to aspects of fragmentation. Again, it's critical. I very much, like Charles, I'm in the UK here, and this is a critical part of the leveling up debate. There's a lot of pushback on devolution of powers because there's no clear evidence when you just look at decentralization measures that is really going to help. So again, understanding how these interactions exactly work is very, very important, and for policymakers to be able to assess how this is in their own situation is important. But, and this brings me to my third point, also to understand the comparative perspective. Comparisons are critical within countries, of course, but also between countries. And a lot of the work that we're looking here at is econometric type of work. So, we get the coefficients, we know there is a relationship, but where we really learn from is to look at some of these individual cases. I so much enjoyed the example that Diane gave us about Prague and Helsinki and Radon, because I think that really helps policymakers to understand how these things interact and what are actually the cities and the regions that they should compare themselves with, right? What is the right comparator here? You know, here in Germany, here in the UK, we tend to be continuously looking at West Germany, at the western part of Germany, as seeing that's the optimal comparator case. Well, is it? And what regions really are those? So I think that comparative perspective and more emphasis on case studies, or at least translating the econometric results into case studies, is going to be very important. A lot of the work here is about, and it came, of course, very much true in the last discussion, the last the last paper that we were looking at, is that a lot of these institutional quality improvements help weaker firms and poorer regions. And once these weaker firms become stronger and the regions become more top regions, we seem to think, well, it's all fine, you know. Now, I mean, why should we continue to worry about it? Although I understand that perspective and analysis is very well done, I think we should be careful not to think too binary about this. Like, okay, we need to care about institutional quality aspects if we're at the weaker end, and we don't have to worry about it once we're doing fine. Of course, you know, there's a lot of dynamics. You know, weaker firms become stronger and the other way around, and weaker regions become stronger. And institutions play actually a critical role in keeping that dynamism going. Also, stronger firms can become weaker, and stronger regions can become weaker as well. So I think we have to be careful not to think too binary about this, which really leads me to my fifth point, and that is that what I'm missing a bit in this discussion is the role of institutions that are really in this intermediary space, that actually drive a lot of this dynamism that is happening in an economy. So, for example, the importance of what's now these days called intermediary RD&I institutions, research, development, and innovation institutions, that are really focused on the creation of capabilities, which I think came up, I think in Charles' comments earlier on. Create the capabilities for diffusion of innovation within and between regions is important. So I think it's that intermediary landscape that we need to understand, and why, you know, this binary thinking about strong and weak is not telling us the whole story. And then last but not least, and again, it came in Alexandra's presentation right at the end, we need to really begin to embed these insights into how do we structure regional innovation ecosystems and entrepreneurial ecosystems. This is about innovation, about entrepreneurship. These ecosystems, there's a lot of work, very good work being done, some of it being presented at various of your meetings. And I think to translate this, the implications of this institutional work on how these ecosystems are being organized is really important. And this is partly about formal arrangements, about, you know, who's collaborating with whom and what kind of task do they have. But a lot of it, frankly, is also about informal arrangements. How do we communicate? What is there a common sense of purpose of what we're talking about? So I think that that element of how we translate institutional quality into the structuring and the organization of regional and entrepreneurial ecosystems is really important. And I think we're right at the bottom of the hour. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I really enjoyed it. I think this is incredibly important work. I learned a lot, and I hope that's true for everyone who attended as well. In particular, also policymakers who can hopefully have some takeaways from this. Thanks.
Thank you, Bart. Thank you very much to everybody who participated today, and special thanks to all our listeners, especially those who were asking questions and hopefully taking some insights from this discussion. If you have any further feedback, don't hesitate to reach out to us. We are always open to discussing these issues more, especially a lot of issues were raised in Bart's kind of concluding remarks. A lot of this are actually active areas of work at the OECD. Step in. We are happy to share expertise, to learn from you as well, because common efforts get us further. Stay updated about our events. As I said before, we have 4 meetings in a year, 2 before summer, 2 after summer. The next one is coming probably in late May, early June. We are finalizing the topic and the dates. We'll be announcing it very soon. And I hope to see you again. Thank you very much.